Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, the only channel putting you to sleep with content so absurd, so historically specific, and so deeply unnecessary that your brain has no choice but to surrender. Tonight, we are stepping behind some of the most heavily guarded walls in the ancient world. We are going inside the Ottoman imperial harem, and before you let your imagination run wild, dim it down a little. Because the real story is simultaneously more fascinating and more mundane than whatever you just pictured. Take a second right now to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is actually your kind of thing. Leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I have a feeling it's somewhere between I should be sleeping and I absolutely cannot stop listening. Grab your pillow, pull your blanket up. If you have a fan, now's the time. Let the white noise take over and let's agree that you are horizontal and not going anywhere. Now, before we begin, let's take a moment to sit with some genuinely important questions. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to live inside a palace so big it had its own postal system? What did you do all day when your entire job was to be impressive? Was there a pecking order? Of course there was. There is always a pecking order. Whether you're in a 16th century Ottoman palace or a modern office with one shared microwave. Did the women inside get along? Did they scheme? Did they get bored? Could you survive years of palace politics without accidentally making an enemy of the woman who controlled your entire future? And what did you eat for breakfast when you lived inside one of the most powerful institutions on earth? And did they have anything resembling a bad day? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the Ottoman Imperial Palace. The year is somewhere in the mid-16th century, the height of the empire's power. You're young, you are clever, you have just arrived in Constantinople, and absolutely nothing about your life is going to be ordinary ever again. Good luck. You did not choose this life the way a person chooses a job or a city or a haircut. It chose you in the way that large, powerful institutions tend to choose people, swiftly, completely, and without much concern for your opinion on the matter. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was not a place you wandered into. It was a place you were brought to, usually as a young girl, selected through a system as deliberate and rigorous as any royal recruitment process in the world. You might have come from the Caucasus Mountains, from the plains of Eastern Europe, from the coasts of Circassia, or from any corner of the vast empire's reach. You were likely between 8 and 12 years old. You spoke little or no Turkish, and you were standing at the gates of Topkapi Palace, which, from the outside, looked less like a home and more like a very organised city that had simply decided to put up some walls and call itself a household. The gates themselves were enormous. Everything here was enormous. The Ottoman Empire at its height controlled territory stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, from the coast of North Africa to the edge of the Caspian Sea. And Topkapi Palace, the beating heart of all that power, was scaled accordingly. Walking through its outer gates was not like entering a building. It was like entering a world with its own laws, its own language, its own social order, and its own very firm ideas about who you were going to become. The women responsible for your arrival were the harem's senior attendants, experienced, composed, and absolutely immune to the wide-eyed disorientation of new arrivals, having processed quite a lot of them. They moved efficiently. There was a process, and the process had been refined over centuries. You were assessed. Your age, your health, your physical appearance, your apparent intelligence, all of it noted, recorded, evaluated. This was not casual. The harem at its peak housed several hundred women at any given time, and every single one of them had arrived through exactly this gate, highlighted with exactly this expression on their face, which was the expression of a person who has just realised that everything they knew has been replaced with something entirely different, and they have not yet figured out what. Here is the thing that the legends always get wrong. The harem was not a prison, in the way the European imagination tended to picture it, all locked doors and weeping captives. It was, in practice, an institution, a very grand, very regimented, very specific kind of institution, a bit like an exceptionally exclusive school that you also happen to live in, that also happened to be attached to the centre of a global empire. You had food, shelter, clothing, education, and medical care. You had, in fact, considerably more material security than most women of your era enjoyed anywhere in the world. What you did not have was the option to leave, which is admittedly a significant caveat, but one the palace preferred not to dwell on. What the harem offered, in exchange for your freedom of movement, was the possibility of advancement unlike anything available to women elsewhere in the 16th century world. The women who rose within this system accumulated real power. Not theoretical power, not the power of influence in a polite, decorative sense. Actual, functional, political power. Some of them corresponded with foreign kings. Some of them shaped the succession of the most powerful empire on earth. The entrance was not a choice. But what came after the entrance, that, in ways that would have surprised almost everyone outside those walls sometimes was, you stood at the gate. You didn't know any of that yet. You just knew it was very large, very loud, and that someone was already moving you toward the next room. Before you were permitted to set foot inside the harem's inner quarters, you were taken to the hammam, the palace bathhouse. And if you'd never encountered a proper Ottoman hammam before, and most new arrivals had not, it was a deeply disorienting experience in the best possible way. The hammam was not a quick rinse. It was a process, a ritual, a very thorough, very systematic, very warm introduction to the idea that personal hygiene in this palace was not optional, not casual, and not something you completed in under 4 minutes while half asleep. The air inside was thick with steam, and the faint scent of rosewater and black soap, a dense olive oil-based cleanser that felt nothing like anything you had used before. Attendants moved around you with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many hundreds of times, which they had because they absolutely had. The Ottoman hammam was a marvel of engineering. The floors were heated from below by a hypocaust system, channels running beneath the marble through which hot air circulated continuously, so that the stone under your feet was always warm, which in a building that was otherwise made of approximately the same material as a cold cave was a genuinely extraordinary sensation. The room itself was domed, and the dome was pierced with small star-shaped windows through which pale, diffused light fell into the steam like something out of a painting that had not been painted yet. The bathing process was structured. First, heat. You sat in the warm room and simply perspired, which the body does whether you invite it to or not, and which is, it turns out, very effective at loosening whatever a long journey had deposited on you. Then the actual cleaning, with the black soap and a keys, a coarse woven mitt used to exfoliate the skin in a way that would seem aggressive if it weren't so immediately satisfying, then rinsing, then more rinsing, then rose water, because everything in the palace involved rose water to at least some degree, and the hammam was not going to be the exception. Your hair was washed, your nails were inspected, your skin, once the steam had done its work, was examined with the detached professionalism of someone completing a quality assessment, which is, in a sense, exactly what was happening. The palace had standards. Those standards started here, at the entrance, with the bath, before you had even been formally introduced to the institution you had just joined. Think of it as onboarding, if onboarding involved marble floors, artisanal soap, and attendants who communicated primarily through expressions that suggested they had seen everything and were mildly surprised by nothing. What emerged from the hammam, after an hour or two of this process, was not quite a different person. You were still you, still disoriented, still not entirely sure what was happening or in what sequence, but you were a noticeably cleaner, considerably more fragrant version of you. Your old clothes had been quietly removed and replaced with new ones, simple, clean, appropriate for a new arrival of unassigned status. The hair that had tangled itself into something impressive during your journey was now combed, oiled, and arranged with more attention than it had probably ever received before. You looked, in other words, like someone who belonged here. You did not yet feel like it. But the palace was patient. It had been doing this for a long time, and it understood that feeling like you belonged was something that came later, after the lessons and the routine and the slow, relentless work of becoming someone who knew which rooms to enter and, just as importantly, which ones to leave before anyone had to ask you to. Nobody in the palace was going to learn your language. That was made gently but firmly clear within the first few days. Turkish was the language of the court, the language of power, the language in which every important conversation, every order, every whispered piece of gossip, and every carefully worded complaint was going to be conducted. And if you wanted to participate in any of those things, which, for your own survival, you very much did, you were going to need to learn it, quickly. The Ottoman palace ran what was essentially one of the most intensive language immersion programs in the pre-modern world, except nobody called it that and there were no certificates at the end. You were simply surrounded, from morning to night, by people speaking Turkish, conducting lessons in Turkish, giving instructions in Turkish, and looking mildly disappointed when you responded in Turkish with the linguistic confidence of a confused tourist. The lessons were formal. A senior woman, usually one of the experienced attendants whose job it was to manage the education of new arrivals, would sit across from you and drill vocabulary with the patient relentlessness of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how long it was going to take. Objects in the room were named. Actions were demonstrated and named. Sentences were repeated until they stopped sounding like noise and started sounding like meaning. Progress was expected, and the expectation was not flexible. This was not, it should be said, entirely a hardship. Language is the thing that makes a world navigable. Before you had Turkish, the palace was a series of beautiful rooms full of people whose words were opaque, whose expressions you were learning to read without context, whose intentions you could only guess at. After a month of lessons, after 6 months, after a year, the walls began to speak. The conversations you had not been able to follow became conversations you could understand, and then participate in, and then conduct on your own terms. The language, once acquired, was a key. But language was not only vocabulary. The Turkish spoken inside the palace was court Turkish, formal, layered, full of Persian and Arabic loanwords that gave it a texture completely different from the simpler Turkish, spoken in the streets of Constantinople. There were registers of speech, ways of addressing senior women that differed from ways of addressing your equals, ways of speaking to the eunuchs that differed from ways of speaking to visiting officials, formal phrasings for formal occasions and softer, more careful language for moments of private conversation. Learning Turkish, in this context, meant learning not just a language but a social instrument. The wrong word in the wrong register to the wrong person could cause a problem that a month of correct words would not easily fix. You also, in learning Turkish, began losing the easy fluency of your native language. Not immediately, not completely. But the brain is a practical organ. It allocates resources toward what is used and slowly withdraws them from what is not, and inside the harem, your mother tongue was not used. There was no one to speak it with, no occasion that called for it. Within a few years, your first language had moved to somewhere distant and interior, a language of memory and dream rather than daily use. This was its own kind of loss. Quiet, private, and not the sort of thing you mention to anyone. because mentioning it served no practical purpose, and the palace had limited patience for impractical sentiments. You learned Turkish. You learned to think in Turkish. And somewhere in that process, without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, you became someone slightly different from who you had been when you arrived. The harem had a structure, a very, very clear structure, the kind of structure that had been refined over centuries by people who took organisational charts extremely seriously and had strong feelings about who sat where and who spoke first. At the absolute top sat the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. Her authority inside the harem was total. She was not a figurehead. She was not ceremonial. She was the person everyone else oriented themselves around. The way a solar system organises itself around a star, loyally, cautiously, and with an awareness that her gravitational pull could end careers. Below her, the hierarchy descended through the Sultan's favourites. The women who had borne him children, the senior concubines, the junior concubines, and all the way down to the newest arrivals who were so far down the pyramid that the pyramid itself was merely a rumour. This was not a vague social pecking order of the kind that develops informally in any group of people spending significant time together. This was formalised, titled, and materially expressed. Each level of the hierarchy came with different apartments, different allowances, different clothing, different degrees of access to different parts of the palace, and different quantities of staff to manage their daily needs. The Valide Sultan had an entire household within the household, her own kitchens, her own treasury, her own ladies-in-waiting, her own network of relationships with powerful men outside the harem walls. A newly arrived courier had a mat, a chest, and instructions she hadn't yet fully understood. What made the system work, or rather what made the system feel like something other than pure arbitrary fortune, was that movement within it was possible. This was not a fixed caste. Women rose. The history of the Ottoman harem is full of women who arrived at the bottom of the pyramid and ended their lives near the top, having navigated their way upward through some combination of skill, intelligence, beauty, timing, loyalty, and, it must be said, a willingness to pay very close attention to how the institution actually functioned versus how it was supposed to function, because those two things in any institution are never entirely the same. There were formal rules and there were informal ones. There was the structure as written and the structure as lived. A woman who understood only the formal hierarchy was at a disadvantage. A woman who understood where the real authority resided on any given Tuesday, who was actually managing the food distribution, which senior attendant was the one everyone went to when they needed something handled quietly. That woman was navigating the actual terrain rather than a map of it. And the terrain shifted. A Valide Sultan died, and the women attached to her household lost their primary source of protection. A new Haseki rose to favour, and the women around her rose with her. A prince fell out of favour, or, in the darker corners of this history, simply ceased to exist, and his mother's position became overnight significantly more complicated. The harem's hierarchy was stable in structure and volatile in occupancy. It was, in this way, not entirely unlike any other workplace in human history, except that most workplaces do not also determine your living arrangements, your social world, your financial security, and your entire future. So perhaps not entirely like other workplaces, but the fundamental human dynamics, who is up, who is down, who is rising, and who has just realised they are not, those were remarkably familiar. You learned the structure quickly, because the alternative was to misread it. And misreading it had consequences you preferred to avoid. Privacy, as a concept, was something the harem had a complicated relationship with. You did not have your own room in the way that a person might imagine having their own room. What you had was a space, a portion of a shared dormitory, a spot in a long room lined with other spots, a section of floor and wall that was yours in the same way that a seat on a very organised train is yours, temporarily, conditionally, and subject to revision. The newer you were, the more communal your accommodations. Senior women had better quarters. Women who had attracted the Sultan's attention had better quarters still. The Valid Sultan had apartments that could have housed a small village. You, in the early days, had a mat, chest for your belongings, and approximately enough elbow room to turn over in your sleep without accidentally elbowing 3 other people, which you would do anyway. The dormitory rooms were not, it should be said, unpleasant. The palace did not do unpleasant interiors. Even the communal sleeping rooms had tiled walls, carved wooden ceilings, and a general level of aesthetic attention that most people in the 16th century would have considered extraordinary. The blankets were wool. The mattresses were filled with cotton. The rooms were heated in winter by braziers, portable metal containers of burning charcoal, which heated the air effectively and smelled faintly of something warm and slightly metallic. Compared to the sleeping arrangements available to the vast majority of people alive on Earth in this era, you were doing extremely well. Compared to the apartments of the senior women you sometimes caught glimpses of, with their carved shuttered windows overlooking the Bosphorus, their private anterooms, their walls hung with embroidered textiles, you were doing somewhat less well. The proximity to other women was, depending on the day, either a source of comfort or a source of the particular kind of low-level friction that emerges whenever human beings live in very close quarters for extended periods of time. You knew exactly how your dormitory mate slept. You knew who had a persistent cough and who talked quietly to herself before she fell asleep and who was almost certainly crying quietly on certain nights and preferred that nobody mention it. They knew the same about you. There was a strange intimacy to this that was entirely separate from friendship. A knowledge of bodies and habits and private moments that developed simply from proximity, whether you sought it out or not. It also meant that nothing was truly secret inside the shared rooms. Not conversations, not moods, not movements in the night. The harem was already an environment of observation. Senior women watched junior women, eunuchs monitored movement through the corridors. The whole institution ran on information, and the dormitories were the most intimate version of this. If you were unhappy, your dormitory mates knew. If you had received a piece of news, good or bad, the emotional residue of it was visible by morning. This was the aspect of harem life that the romantic accounts always overlooked. Not the political intrigue, not the luxury. Those things were real enough, but the sheer density of other people. The lack of a door you could close, the absence of a room that was entirely yours, that held only your own air and your own sounds and your own thoughts, with nobody else's layered in. You adapted. Everyone did. But you never quite stopped noticing the distance between the life you were living and the concept of solitude, which became, over time, one of the things you valued most precisely because it was the thing most consistently unavailable. Every new arrival was assigned to a more senior woman whose job it was to transform a frightened, disoriented girl from somewhere else entirely into a functioning member of palace society. This woman was called your ustaz, your teacher and supervisor, and she was one of the most important people you would ever meet, whether you wanted her to be or not. She was not a gentle figure. She was not there to be your friend or to make your transition comfortable. She was there to train you, and training meant something very specific inside the palace walls. It meant music if you had any aptitude for it. It meant needlework in which you were expected to reach a standard of precision that would have alarmed a professional embroiderer. It meant learning to walk correctly, to speak correctly, to stand in a room correctly, and to understand, without being told explicitly, exactly when to leave one. Your ustaz had herself come up through this same system. She had sat where you were sitting. She had made the mistakes you were going to make and learned the lessons you were going to learn. and she had survived long enough and risen far enough within the institution to be trusted with the training of new arrivals, which was not a minor responsibility. The quality of what she produced reflected on her. If her student embarrassed herself in front of a senior woman, that embarrassment had an address, and the address was your ustaz. This created a dynamic that was, at minimum, efficient. She was motivated to teach well. You were motivated to learn, because her disappointment had immediate consequences for your daily life in ways that made theoretical future consequences feel very present. There was nothing abstract about the relationship. She saw you every day. She assessed your progress, noted your failures, marked your improvements, and communicated all of these things through a system of expressions and tones and silences that became, over time, as legible as language. The ustaz also modelled behaviour that went beyond any specific skill. She showed you how to move through the harem social world, how to read the atmosphere of a room before you committed to entering it fully, how to offer an opinion without asserting it, how to be in the presence of a more powerful woman in a way that communicated respect without communicating fear, because the two things looked almost identical from the outside, but were received very differently by the person you were communicating them to. She also, in quieter moments, sometimes told you things that were not part of any official curriculum, which women were worth cultivating, which conflicts to stay away from, which senior attendants had long memories for slights, and which ones moved on quickly. This informal knowledge, unwritten, unacknowledged, transmitted in fragments during the margins of lessons, was in some ways more valuable than anything in the formal programme. It was the operating manual for the institution as it actually functioned, rather than as it was supposed to function. You did not always like your ustaz. This was probably fine, and she would not have been particularly concerned either way. Likeability was not the goal. Competence was the goal. Survival was the goal. And the woman who had been assigned to turn you into a person capable of navigating this world had neither the time nor the inclination to be liked while she was doing it. What you had with her was not friendship. It was something more durable than that. A debt, a foundation, and the particular kind of grudging respect that forms between people when one of them has taught the other something that turned out to genuinely matter. Music in the Ottoman court was not background noise. It was not something you put on while you were doing something else. It was a serious art form, taught seriously, practiced seriously, and performed seriously, and if you showed any natural ability for it, that ability was going to be developed with the kind of focus and intention that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever been enrolled in lessons by an extremely ambitious parent. The most common instruments were the ud, a pear-shaped stringed instrument that was the ancestor of the European lute, the kanun, a flat zither played with small plectrums worn on the fingers, and the knee, a reed flute whose sound could fill a room with something that felt simultaneously ancient and immediate. You were not expected to master all of them. Alwas, you were expected to master the one you were assigned, to the level that would allow you to perform in front of people who genuinely knew what they were listening to. This last part mattered. The audience for your music was not casual. The women of the harem, including the senior women whose approval governed your daily existence, had spent years listening to excellent music performed by skilled musicians. They had developed ears. An uncertain note was audible to them. A fumbled transition was noticed. The wrong tempo on a piece that had a correct tempo was the kind of thing that produced a silence afterwards. A particular quality of silence that communicated, without a single word, that what had just occurred was not quite sufficient. Practice was therefore non-negotiable. Hours of it, daily in the early period of your training. The fingertips that had already been toughened by needlework developed additional calluses from the ud strings. The breath control required by the ney, which demanded a specific embouchure and a specific relationship between breath and tone that took months to develop, made you light-headed in the early stages in a way that was both undignified and extremely inconvenient. The cannon's plectrums, worn on the fingers like tiny rings, felt awkward for weeks before they began to feel like extensions of the hand. And then, slowly, something changed. The instrument that had been a source of frustration began to be a source of something else. Not quite pleasure yet, but a different quality of engagement. You stopped thinking about the mechanics and started hearing the music. Yeah, your fingers found positions they had practiced so many times that they moved there independently. The piece that had required conscious effort began to unfold with something approaching ease. Music, inside the harem, was also one of the few activities that could make you genuinely forget where you were. When you were playing, really playing, in the state of absorption that comes with sufficient skill, the room, the hierarchy, the complex social arithmetic of the palace all receded. There was only the instrument and the sound and the particular quality of attention that music demanded and rewarded in equal measure. Skilled musicians inside the harem were valued. This is worth understanding practically, not just romantically. A woman who could play beautifully was an asset at gatherings, at celebrations, or at the private entertainments the Sultan's household organised. She was present in rooms that other women were not present in. She was noticed by people whose noticing mattered. Music was, in this sense, not simply an art. It was a form of visibility, and inside the harem, visibility carefully managed was the beginning of everything. If music was the art of the ear, embroidery was the art of the eye, and the Ottoman palace took both with identical seriousness. The textile traditions of the harem were extraordinary. The women inside produced needlework of such technical complexity and visual refinement that examples of it are now in museums, behind glass, with little plaques underneath them explaining how difficult it was to make. You were not creating decorative items, you were creating status objects. The embroidery you produced would be given as diplomatic gifts, used to decorate palace interiors, presented to important visitors, and in some cases sent to foreign courts as demonstrations of Ottoman civilization. No pressure. Your fingers in the early months would ache in a way you did not know fingers could ache. The thread would slip. The pattern would drift. The woman supervising you would say nothing, which was somehow worse than if she had said something. Ottoman embroidery used silk thread and metallic thread, gold and silver wire wrapped around a silk core to produce patterns of extraordinary density and precision. The stitch types were numerous, and each had its own requirements. The satin stitch that produced flat, lustrous surfaces, or the couching technique in which heavy metallic threads were laid on the fabric and stitched down with finer threads. The intricate pulled-work techniques that transformed the fabric itself into a pattern of controlled voids. Mastering these stitches was not a matter of weeks. It was a matter of years. The designs were drawn from a visual vocabulary that was distinctly Ottoman. The tulip, which held particular symbolic significance in the culture, stylized into forms that bore only a familial relationship to the actual flower. The carnation, the hyacinth, the cypress tree, palmettes and arabesques, geometric borders of a precision that required steady hands and, frankly, excellent eyesight. Mistakes in a piece of embroidery at this level of ambition were difficult to correct. Unpicking metallic thread from fabric left marks. The piece you were working on had to be right, which meant you had to be right, which meant the preliminary stages, the sketching, the transferring of the pattern to the fabric, the selection and arrangement of thread colours had to be handled with a care that made the actual stitching seem almost relaxed by comparison. If this sounds like a great deal of effort for a decorative art, it is worth remembering what these objects represented. A finely embroidered garment sent from the Ottoman court to a European monarch communicated something specific about the empire that produced it. Wealth, refinement, artistic sophistication, and a surplus of skilled labour that could afford to spend significant time creating things of beauty. It was soft power in the most literal sense, thread and needle as diplomatic argument. Inside the harem, embroidery also functioned as a way of marking time. The long hours of sitting, stitching, watching a pattern grow millimetre by millimetre from a blank piece of fabric, it was meditative in the way that repetitive skilled work tends to become meditative once the skill is sufficiently internalised. Your hands moved. Your mind, freed from the need to direct the hands, went elsewhere. The conversations that happened over embroidery frames were some of the most honest and unguarded you would have in the palace, because everyone was looking at their work rather than at each other, which made saying things slightly easier than it would otherwise have been. Your fingers eventually stopped hurting, the patterns eventually stopped drifting, and one day you held up a piece of work and it looked not perfect, not yet, but like something that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. That was not a small thing. The hammam was not just for bathing. If you understood only one thing about how the harem actually functioned as a social environment, it should be this. The bathhouse was the water cooler, the town square, the group chat, and the therapy session all condensed into one very steamy room. Women went to the hammam daily, not always for the full bathing ritual, sometimes simply to sit, to talk, to listen, to be seen, and to observe who was talking to whom and for how long and in what tone of voice. In a world where your physical movements were highly regulated and your social interactions were carefully structured, the hammam represented one of the few genuinely relaxed spaces available. The rules loosened slightly in the steam. Conversations happened that would not have happened in the formal quarters. Information moved. Alliances shifted. You could learn more about the actual state of affairs inside the harem from 1 hour in the hammam than from 3 days of careful observation anywhere else. The hammam was also one of the few spaces where hierarchy, while never entirely absent, was at least somewhat softened by the logistics of the situation. Everyone in a bathhouse is, at some fundamental level, in the same condition, which creates a levelling effect that architecture and clothing normally prevent. Senior women did not bathe alongside junior women. There were designated times and arrangements. But within the informal social sessions that surrounded bathing, the usual rigid separations were somewhat permeable. A woman 2 ranks above you might speak to you in the hammam in a tone she would not use in the formal quarters, and you could respond in kind, provided you had the sense to read exactly how much latitude was being offered, and not exceed it by a single syllable. The hammam had its own rituals around the social event of bathing. Women brought food, sweets, dried fruits, small pastries, and ate together in the warm room. They brought musical instruments sometimes, and the sound of a knee or a small hand drum would drift through the steam in a way that made the whole experience feel on good days genuinely pleasant. Hair was arranged and admired. New kaftans were displayed. Information about developments in the outer palace. News that had filtered in through the eunuchs or through the attendants who moved between the harem and other parts of the palace was circulated, discussed, and interpreted by women who understood that information was a form of currency and treated it accordingly, because it was, in this place, one of the most important currencies available. You had no access to money in the early stages of your life in the harem. You had no formal authority. What you had was what you knew and who you knew it with, and the hammam was where a significant portion of both was managed. An alliance formed over a conversation in the warm steam of a bathhouse was not a less serious alliance for having been formed there. A piece of information shared in apparent casualness was not less carefully calculated for having been delivered casually. The relaxed atmosphere was real, and it was also, at least in part, a style. You learned to operate in both registers simultaneously, to be genuinely present in the warmth and ease of it, to actually enjoy the conversation, the food, the steam on your skin, and also to be paying attention. The two things were not incompatible. They were, if anything, mutually reinforcing. The best social operators in the harem were not cold calculators. They were warm, charming, genuinely pleasant company who also happened to be paying very close attention. And the hammam was where you went to practice being both at once. The Ottoman palace kitchens were, by any reasonable standard, among the most impressive culinary operations in the pre-modern world. At their peak, the palace kitchens employed hundreds of staff and fed thousands of people daily. But the Sultan, his family, the harem women, the palace guards, the administrators, the servants, and everyone else who existed within the vast ecosystem of Topkapi. The food that reached the harem was not the food the Sultan ate. Exactly. There were hierarchies within the kitchen system as well, because of course there were. The women at the top of the harem hierarchy ate exceptionally well. Rice dishes perfumed with saffron and dotted with currants and pine nuts, slow-cooked lamb falling from the bone, syrup-soaked pastries layered with pistachios, fresh fruit in all seasons because the palace had access to supply networks that made seasonality somewhat optional. As a new arrival at the bottom of the social ladder, your meals were simpler, more institutional, more reliably present than they were interesting. The main meal of the day arrived in the mid-afternoon, carried through the harem corridors by kitchen attendants and large covered trays. The food was distributed by rank, which meant that by the time the trays reached the junior dormitories, the portion sizes were accurate, but the garnishes were somewhat theoretical. You ate from low tables seated on cushions on the floor, using bread to scoop stews and rice dishes in the traditional manner. There were spoons, there were no forks. The fork was a European affectation that the Ottoman palace considered unnecessary and slightly eccentric. Bread was the primary utensil, and also a significant part of the meal itself, freshly baked daily in the palace ovens in rounds that were hot and fragrant in a way that made everything else taste better simply by association. The Ottoman culinary tradition was genuinely sophisticated. This was not a civilization that treated food as fuel. It treated food as a form of artistry, a subject worthy of serious attention, and the palace kitchens were where that attention was most fully expressed. Lamb and mutton were the primary meats, prepared in ways that varied by season, occasion, and the rank of the intended recipient. Braised with dried fruits, spiced with cumin and coriander, slow-cooked until the distinction between the meat and the sauce became a philosophical question. Rice was prepared in pilaf styles that bore no resemblance to the plain-boiled grain of less invested culinary traditions. Vegetables, eggplants, zucchini, stuffed peppers were treated with the seriousness they deserved. On. Sweets were the point at which the Ottoman kitchen revealed its genuine ambitions. Baklava, layers of thin pastry with ground nuts and honey syrup, was produced in the palace kitchens with a consistency and quality that defined the standard the outside world attempted to replicate. Helva, made from semolina or sesame paste, came in varieties that ranged from everyday to ceremonial. Lokum, what Europeans would later call Turkish delight, was produced in flavours that changed with the season and the occasion. On celebration days, the sweet distribution through the harem was an event in itself, a tangible, delicious marker of a good day, shared across all levels of the hierarchy in a way that temporarily flattened the usual distinctions. Coffee arrived in the Ottoman palace in the 16th century and spread through the harem with the speed of something that people genuinely needed, which it turned out they did. The preparation and serving of coffee became its own ritual. The small copper pot, the specific grind, the way it was served in tiny cups with no handles, and the offering of coffee became a social gesture freighted with meaning. To serve someone coffee was to welcome them. To receive it was to be acknowledged. Even the morning drink, was embedded in the social fabric of the institution in ways that made the simple act of being thirsty into something slightly more complicated and considerably more interesting than it would have been anywhere else. What you wore inside the harem was not a personal choice exactly. It was a signal, a marker, a way of communicating your position in the hierarchy to everyone around you without anyone having to say a word. The colour of your kaftan, the quality of the fabric, the jewellery you were or were not permitted to wear, the style of your head covering, all of it was legible to anyone who knew how to read it, and everyone inside knew how to read it. Fabric in the Ottoman palace was a serious business. The palace had its own textile workshops producing silks, velvets, and brocades of extraordinary quality. The patterns on these fabrics, tulips, carnations, geometric repeats, pomegranates, were not random. They were part of a visual language that communicated imperial taste, seasonal propriety, and formal occasion. Getting dressed in the morning was, in this sense, less like choosing an outfit and more like composing a sentence that everyone around you would immediately pass for meaning. The kaftan was the foundational garment of palace dress, a long loose robe with wide sleeves cut to fall from the shoulders to the ankle in a single unbroken line that was simultaneously simple in construction and endlessly variable in execution. The difference between a junior woman's kaftan and a senior woman's kaftan was not the shape. It was everything else. The fabric, plain wool versus silk versus cloth of gold, which was exactly what it sounds like and cost accordingly. The lining, plain cotton versus fur-trimmed versus lined, with a contrasting silk that flashed at the cuffs and hem when the wearer moved. The embroidery at the collar and cuffs, absent, present, or so elaborate that it constituted a significant portion of the garment's total value. You could read a woman's rank with reasonable accuracy from across a room before she spoke, before you saw her face clearly, simply by reading her clothes. This was a feature rather than a flaw. The harem was an institution that ran on legible hierarchy, and the dress code was one of the mechanisms by which that hierarchy was maintained without requiring anyone to announce it constantly out loud. Jewellery functioned similarly. In the early period of your residence you wore little, small earrings perhaps, and a simple pin for your head covering. As you rose, the jewellery accumulated, bracelets, rings, pendant necklaces in gold set with the precious and semi-precious stones that the Ottoman treasury had access to in extraordinary quantities. Rubies from Burma, emeralds from Colombia, arriving via the trade networks that connected the empire to the Americas, whether the empire acknowledged those connections officially or not. Turquoise from Persia, pearls from the Gulf, sewn directly onto garments in patterns that took months to complete. Perfume was the invisible layer of all this. The Ottoman world was deeply invested in scent. Rosewater appeared in cooking, in bathing, in the rinsing of laundry. Oud, the resinous wood, burned as incense. Perfumed the interiors of rooms in a way that became so familiar it was simply the smell of the palace, the baseline against which every other scent was measured. A woman who smelled wrong, of something too sharp, too foreign, too unpalace, was a woman whose integration was incomplete. Scent was the final element of a presentation that was, so, from hair to hem, a performance of belonging. And here is the thing about performing belonging long enough. At a certain point, it stops being a performance. The clothes that felt foreign on your first day became, over months and years, simply what you wore. The visual language you had decoded became your own native tongue. You stopped reading the room and started being part of what the room was saying. The word kariye referred to the women in the harem who had not yet achieved any particular formal status. The new arrivals, the trainees, the ones still in the process of becoming whatever they were going to become. Being a kariye was the entry level, and like most entry-level positions in any organisation, it came with a very high workload, a very low amount of personal authority, and an enormous amount of observation, performance, and quiet manoeuvring. As a kariye, you served. You assisted more senior women with their daily routines. You ran errands through the palace corridors. You attended ceremonies and formal occasions as part of the collective background presence that made the whole operation look impressively staffed. And you watched. You watched everything. You noted who smiled at whom, who was summoned and when, who returned from a summons looking pleased, and who returned looking like they had just had a very interesting conversation with a wall. The duties of a carrier were not glamorous. You helped senior women dress in the mornings, which meant managing layers of fabric and jewellery with fingers that were still developing the dexterity the task required. You carried trays, you delivered messages, not important messages, not yet, but the small logistical communications that kept the institution's daily operations running. You cleaned. The palace was enormous, and the palace staff was also enormous. But the work of maintaining an institution of this size was genuinely vast, and the junior women contributed to it in ways that were beneath the notice of everyone above them and absolutely essential to the functioning of everything. This was not, it should be noted, unusual by the standards of the era or the institution. The career period was understood by everyone inside the harem, including the women who were living through it, as a transitional phase. A chrysalis stage. The question was not whether you would remain a career forever. The question was what you would become when you weren't one anymore. Yeah, and that question was answered by everything you did during this period, including things that seemed too small to matter, and absolutely did. Your appearance during these years was under constant and largely unacknowledged assessment. Not formal assessment with written records, nothing so legible as that. But the senior women who moved through the same spaces as you were noticing. The ustaz who supervised your training was forming opinions that she shared with other senior women in conversations you were not present for. The eunuchs who managed access and movement within the palace were noting which junior women conducted themselves with appropriate discretion, and which ones were developing reputations they would have preferred not to have. Reputations formed quickly inside a closed institution, much more quickly than they formed in the open world, where the audience for your behaviour was distributed and varied. Here, the audience was concentrated, attentive, and had very little else to do but observe. A single moment of poor judgment, a careless comment overheard by the wrong person, a failure of composure at an inconvenient moment, could attach itself to your name and follow it around the harem corridors for months. The carrier who thrived in this environment was the one who understood the game without appearing to play it, who worked hard without complaint, who was pleasant without being aggressively cheerful, who was observant without appearing to observe, who was, in short, the kind of person that people around her found easy to trust, which is the most useful reputation available in any institution, and the most difficult one to manufacture if it isn't at least partially genuine. Advancement in the harem did not happen by accident, or rather, it occasionally happened by accident, in the way that a very prepared person sometimes appears to be lucky, because the preparation was invisible, and the result looks like good fortune from the outside. To move up from career status, you needed to be noticed. And to be noticed, you needed to demonstrate something worth noticing. Exceptional skill in music. Extraordinary beauty. A personality that was simultaneously charming and carefully managed. Or some combination of all three that caught the attention of the right people at the right moment. The most direct route to advancement was, of course, attracting the Sultan's attention. But this was not a simple thing to engineer. It's a soul. The Sultan did not wander through the harem browsing. There was an entire process, mediated by senior women and palace officials, by which a woman might be formally presented, considered and selected. That process began long before the Sultan was involved. It began with the Valid Sultan, who took an active interest in the women of the harem, and whose opinion of any individual woman was the first and most critical filter. A woman the Valid Sultan disliked, or distrusted, or simply found unimpressive, was unlikely to advance regardless of what other qualities she possessed. A woman the Valid Sultan approved of had the most important gate already open. This was not a trivial consideration. The Valid Sultan was the most powerful woman in the palace, and her assessment of character was shaped by decades of experience observing human behaviour in a highly pressurised environment. She was not easily fooled. She was not susceptible to superficial charm. She had watched too many women try it. Formal presentation to the Sultan was a ceremony with its own protocol. A woman selected for presentation was dressed with particular care, her appearance managed by senior attendants, whose expertise in this kind of preparation was considerable. She was schooled in how to enter a room, how to stand, how to speak if spoken to, how to conduct herself during the encounter with a composure that would read as confident rather than rehearsed, even though it was absolutely rehearsed. The margin for error was essentially zero, and everyone involved understood this. If the Sultan expressed continued interest, the woman's status shifted immediately and visibly. She was moved to better quarters, her allowance increased, the senior women around her adjusted their treatment of her, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the small incremental ways that communicated a change in social mathematics. Women who had previously not bothered to learn her name began to learn it. Women who had treated her with the brisk efficiency reserved for junior staff began to linger in conversation. Social weather is sensitive to changes in temperature that way. But advancement was not only the Sultan's route. Women rose through demonstrated competence, through the loyalty of powerful patrons, through the accumulation of trust and relationships that translated into formal changes in their status over time. A woman appointed to a senior administrative role within the harem, managing a section of the dormitories, overseeing the training of new arrivals, handling specific logistical responsibilities, had advanced through a different mechanism but toward a similar result. More authority, more resources, more ability to shape the environment she lived in. The harem rewarded women who were excellent at something and who made themselves visible in the exercise of that excellence at exactly the right moments. It punished women who were visibly ambitious in ways that made others uncomfortable. Ambition was acceptable, even admirable, but it needed to wear the right clothes, which, in the Ottoman harem, was always the most important consideration. Of all the figures inside the harem, none carried more actual, functional, a real-world political weight than the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. This was not an honorary title. This was not ceremonial influence that existed on paper, but dissolved in practice. The Valid Sultan controlled the internal administration of the harem, meaning she effectively controlled the daily lives of hundreds of women and the institution's entire social and political ecosystem. She managed the presentation of women to her son. She maintained relationships with grand viziers and other senior officials. She corresponded with foreign powers. During periods when her son was young, distracted, or simply trusted her judgment, which was often, she was effectively co-ruling the most powerful empire in the world from an apartment in Topkapi Palace. The 16th century Ottoman Empire had a term for this period of exceptional female political authority. Historians later called it the Sultanate of Women. The women involved did not call it anything. They were too busy running things. The Valid Sultan's apartments were the physical expression of her authority. Located in the heart of the harem complex, adjacent to the Sultan's own quarters, her rooms occupied a position that was both symbolic and strategically practical. She was close to her son, which meant she was close to power, which meant the people who needed access to power came to her. Her reception room received a constant traffic of senior officials, ambitious women, eunuchs bearing messages, and attendants managing the 1,000 small administrative details of an institution this size. She held these audiences with the ease of someone who had been managing information and people for decades, because she had. Her personal income was substantial and independently controlled. The Valide Sultan received revenues from properties and endowments assigned specifically to her position, money that she could spend, distribute and invest according to her own judgment. She founded mosques. She funded schools and charitable institutions in Constantinople and throughout the empire, in the tradition of Ottoman imperial philanthropy that was both genuinely charitable and an extremely effective form of public reputation management. A woman who built a mosque in her name was a woman who had written herself into the physical landscape of the city in a way that outlasted any political moment. What made the Valide Sultan's position structurally unusual was that her authority was entirely legitimate and entirely unofficial. She held no formal title in the government. She sat in no council. She appeared in no official document as decision-maker. And yet, decisions moved through her. Appointments were influenced by her. Grand Viziers who wanted sustained access to the Sultan cultivated her goodwill with the same seriousness they applied to cultivating anyone whose goodwill they genuinely needed. For every woman inside the harem, the Valide Sultan was the most important single figure in the environment. Not the Sultan, he was the ultimate authority, yes, but he was also at a distance, mediated by ceremony and process and the Valide Sultan herself. She was present, she was immediate. She was the person whose opinion of you shaped your daily reality in ways the Sultan's opinion did not, because she was here, in these corridors, in these rooms, every single day. Understanding her, her preferences, her values, her moods, the particular qualities she admired and the ones she found tedious, was not optional. It was survival. If being noticed was the first rung of the ladder, becoming a Haseki was the top. The Haseki was the Sultan's chief consort, the woman who had captured not just his attention but his sustained favour, who had borne him a son, and who occupied a formal position in the palace hierarchy that came with its own apartments, its own staff, its own income, and its own terrifying degree of political consequence. The most famous Haseki in Ottoman history was Hürrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, who began her life in the harem as a courier and ended it as the most influential woman in the empire, legally freed, formally married to Suleiman the Magnificent, corresponding with foreign kings, managing political affairs, and doing all of this from inside walls that were supposed to keep the outside world at a distance. She is proof of what the harem system could produce when ambition, intelligence, and opportunity aligned in one person at the right moment. The formal title of Haseki was introduced specifically for Hürrem. Before her, there was no such title. The Sultan's concubines had no formal rank that could be enumerated and officially recorded. Her elevation created a precedent, and precedents in the Ottoman palace, once established, had a way of becoming permanent. After Hürrem, the Haseki was a recognised position with defined privileges, and the competition for it, unspoken, never directly acknowledged, conducted entirely through the language of performance and impression, was the organising tension of ambition inside the harem. The life of a Haseki was materially extraordinary. Her apartments were among the finest in the harem complex, rooms with views of the Bosphorus, walls tiled in the finest Iznik ceramics, ceilings painted and gilded, private bathrooms with their own heated marble floors. Her clothing allowance was significant and her jewellery reflected it. She had her own ladies-in-waiting, women whose entire function was to attend to her needs and whose status was itself elevated by the association. She was, within the harem walls, a power centre in her own right, but the Haseki's position was also, yet in ways that the physical splendour tended to obscure, deeply precarious. It rested entirely on the sustained attention of one man whose attention was by nature and by institutional design distributed across multiple women and the vast complexity of running an empire. A Haseki who lost the Sultan's favour did not simply return to her previous circumstances. She moved into a different and difficult category, a woman who had been favoured and was no longer, which was socially and practically worse than a woman who had never been favoured at all. The palace had long memories, and the hierarchy adjusted accordingly. The Haseki who secured her position most effectively was the one who understood that the Sultan's favour was necessary but not sufficient. What additionally required cultivation was the relationship with the Valide Sultan, a relationship that was structurally tense because the two women occupied adjacent positions of authority that could either reinforce each other or conflict, and history suggested both outcomes were equally possible. Hurrem and her mother-in-law navigated decades of this tension with varying degrees of grace. Lesser-known Hasekis managed it with varying degrees of disaster. The position was, in short, the most powerful available to a woman inside the harem, and simultaneously among the most complex to maintain. It was the top of the pyramid, and the pyramid's top was a very small surface on which to stand for a very long time, with everyone below watching to see whether you kept your balance. A day in the harem followed rhythms, not the spontaneous, chaotic rhythms of a life lived on your own terms, but the structured, the institutional rhythms of a place that had been running itself for a very long time and had developed strong opinions about what happened when. The day began with the call to prayer, because the call to prayer began every Ottoman day, palace or otherwise. Morning prayers were observed. Breakfast followed, a simpler meal, bread and olives, and yogurt, tea, eaten in the communal spaces of the harem's lower tiers, or, for senior women, in more private quarters. The morning hours were given to lessons and practice, music, embroidery, language, whatever your current curriculum required of you. The afternoon brought the hammam, if it was your day. It brought reading, for those who had been taught to read. It brought socialising in the courtyards, which were beautiful and available and absolutely monitored. The structure of the day was not oppressive in the way that a schedule feels oppressive when it is imposed from outside and resisted from within. After the initial period of adjustment, which was genuinely difficult, because the rhythms of the palace were not natural rhythms, they were institutional ones, and the body needed time to accept them. The routine became its own kind of comfort. You knew what came next. In a life that had been uprooted and transplanted into entirely unfamiliar soil, knowing what came next was not a small thing. The midday prayer marked the transition from the morning's activities to the afternoon's. The main meal arrived in the early afternoon, the largest of the day, and the period following it was the closest the harem came to genuine leisure time. An hour or two in which the formal demands of training and duty were suspended, and the women of the harem existed in the slightly looser social atmosphere that followed a communal meal. Conversations were easier. The hierarchical formalities that structured the rest of the day relaxed slightly, in the way that they always do after everyone has eaten. Even in the most rigorously organised institution in the world, the hour after lunch is the hour after lunch. The late afternoon was for prayer again, and then for the kinds of activities that were less structured, visiting between women whose rooms were adjacent or whose relationships permitted casual social calls. The quieter individual pursuits of reading or writing or simply sitting in a courtyard in the diminishing light. In winter, when daylight contracted, this period was shorter and more interior, the rooms lit by oil lamps and candles, the atmosphere closer and warmer, conversation the primary entertainment. The evening meal was lighter. After it, depending on the occasion, there might be music, a formal performance by the harem's musicians for an audience of senior women, or the more casual playing that happened in dormitory rooms among women who shared their living space and had developed the kind of easiness with each other that came from years of proximity. On significant occasions, A birth, a religious holiday, a celebration of military victory. The evening would extend into something more elaborate, with entertainment and food, and the kind of social energy that was genuinely enjoyable, and then the final prayer of the day, and sleep, and tomorrow the same rhythms again. Yet the routine that had seemed constraining in the beginning revealed itself, over time, to be the architecture of a life. Not the life you would have chosen if choosing had been available, but a life with shape and structure, and enough small pleasures distributed through the hours to make the hours bearable, and sometimes more than that. The harem was not a single building. It was a complex of buildings, corridors, staircases, and, crucially, courtyards. Open-air spaces where the women of the harem could walk, sit, take in sunlight, grow herbs and flowers, and exist in the outside world in a way that was technically outdoors while remaining completely enclosed. The courtyards were beautiful. This is worth saying plainly, because the harem had a physical environment that was designed with serious intention. Fountains ran in the centre of tiled courtyards. Trees provided shade in summer. The tiles on the walls and floors were Iznik ceramics in deep blues and greens, botanical patterns flowing across every surface. If you had to be somewhere, this was not the worst somewhere to be. You were not, of course, free to leave and go somewhere else, but the courtyard was a genuine gift. Light, air, colour, and the company of other women who were also very much in need of all three. The main courtyard of the harem was a space of considerable size, large enough that a group of women could occupy one end of it, with a reasonable degree of conversational privacy, while another group occupied the other end. There were raised platforms covered with cushions where women sat in good weather. There were shaded colonnades along the walls where you could escape the direct sun of the Istanbul summer, which was serious and not to be underestimated, particularly in August when the city shimmered in a heat that the marble courtyards absorbed and radiated back with considerable enthusiasm. In the courtyard, the usual restrictions on movement and interaction were slightly loosened. Women who would not have occasion to speak to each other in the formal interior spaces might find themselves adjacent in the courtyard and conduct the kind of brief, apparently casual conversation that was actually anything but casual. Information about who was rising and who was falling, about what had been heard from the outer palace, about which senior woman was looking for an additional attendant or which eunuch was currently well disposed toward requests. All of this could be exchanged in the courtyard under cover of the general social noise of a group of women enjoying the afternoon air. The courtyard also provided something that the interior rooms, however beautiful, could not: the sky. The actual sky, visible from wall to wall above you, changeable and vast in a way that the tiled ceilings of the palace rooms were not. On clear days you could see the blue of it intensified by the white of the surrounding walls. On overcast days the light it produced was softer and more diffused, flattering to complexions in a way that indoor lamplight was not, which the women of the harem were entirely aware of. In spring, when the city's famous flowers were blooming, though the air in the courtyards carried something from outside the walls, a suggestion of the world beyond carried on whatever wind was moving through Istanbul on that particular afternoon. This was, for many women, one of the most valuable aspects of the courtyard: the wind. It came from somewhere outside. It had been moments ago somewhere else entirely, over the Bosphorus, over the city streets, over the market stalls and the mosques and the harbour full of ships going places. It carried no message, it delivered no information, but it arrived from the outside world and touched the inside one, and on difficult days that was enough to make the afternoon manageable. You tilted your face up toward it and let it happen, and nobody could monitor that particular moment or assign it a meaning or evaluate it as a social performance. And it was just wind, and it was enough. The harem was not, for most of its inhabitants on most days, a place of high drama and political intrigue. It was for most of its inhabitants on most days a place of routine, and routine, stretched across months and years, has a way of becoming boredom. A very specific, high-quality, architecturally beautiful boredom, but boredom nonetheless. The women inside the harem had lessons and practice and duties and social obligations, but they did not have jobs in the modern sense. They did not have projects with deadlines or problems that needed solving in new ways each day. They were not permitted to leave and explore the city. They were not permitted to pursue interests that took them outside the institution's bounds. They were in a palace that was also, in the most refined and comfortable way imaginable, a very large, very gilded cage, and inside that cage some women read, some embroidered obsessively, some composed poetry. Poetry was, in fact, a significant outlet. The Ottoman literary tradition was rich, and the harem was part of it. Women inside the palace wrote poetry, circulated it among their peers, and in some cases produced work of genuine artistic merit that was recognised as such within the literary culture of the empire. Writing required only paper and ink, which were available, and time, which was the one resource the harem provided in essentially unlimited quantities. A woman with a talent for verse could spend her hours constructing elaborate ghazals. Yes, to see a traditional Ottoman poetic form with a complex rhyme scheme and a philosophical sophistication that required both technical skill and genuine depth of feeling. The feelings, at least, were reliably available. Others turned to devotion. The religious life offered a structure within the structure, additional prayers beyond the 5 daily ones, the recitation of specific verses, the practice of a contemplative engagement with faith that was both personally sustaining and socially acceptable in a way that other kinds of self-expression were not always permitted to be. A woman known for her religious devotion was a woman whose inner life was understood to be occupied in an approved direction, which created a certain amount of privacy around the inner life, which was itself valuable. Some women simply slept more than was strictly necessary. Now, this is not a character flaw. It is a response to an environment that provides insufficient stimulation, which the human brain manages by going offline more often than it otherwise would. Afternoon naps were common and generally unremarked upon. The long hours of summer afternoons in particular, too hot for energetic activity, too bright for easy sleep at the normal time, stretching out with a torpor that felt like time had decided to stop cooperating, were frequently spent horizontal, drifting in and out of a drowsiness that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, but somewhere in between where nothing particularly had to be thought about or managed. The boredom was real, and it was one of the aspects of harem life least compatible with the romantic accounts. It did not make the setting less beautiful. It did not diminish the genuine achievements of the women who navigated the institution's politics and rose within its hierarchy. It simply meant that the texture of daily life, for the majority of women in the harem for the majority of their time there, was not the texture of high drama. It was the texture of time passing with insufficient variety, which is its own specific and entirely unglamorous kind of difficulty. The women who thrived were the ones who found, in the resources available to them, poetry, music, devotion, deep friendship, the patient cultivation of skills, enough to fill the hours with something that felt, if not always like meaning, at least like purpose. Islam was the organizing principle beneath every other organizing principle in the Ottoman palace. The 5 daily prayers structured time in a way that no schedule could replicate. They happened consistently, regardless of what else was occurring, and the harem observed them fully. Women who'd been brought from non-Muslim regions converted, as was expected and as was entirely standard practice. Religious education was part of the harem curriculum, and literacy, where it existed, often began with Quranic recitation. The religious calendar brought its own rhythms to the harem. Ramadan transformed daily life completely, with fasting through daylight hours and iftar meals that became the social centerpiece of each evening. Religious holidays brought celebrations, special foods, and a degree of festivity that broke the ordinary routine in ways everyone appreciated. For women living inside a highly regulated environment, the ritual calendar offered something valuable: moments of collective meaning that belonged to everyone equally, regardless of status. The 5 daily prayers were, in practical terms, the most reliable constant in the harem's day. Everything else, lessons, meals, social visits, the various duties of palace life, organised itself around the prayer times. The call to prayer from the palace mosques and from the minarets visible beyond the walls was not just a sound. It was a marker, a reset, a moment in which the social hierarchies and ongoing political calculations of the harem were briefly set aside in favour of a shared act of devotion that was, at least in its form, identical for every woman present regardless of rank. The physical space of prayer was communal. Women prayed together in the harem's mosque, a proper mosque, zlay. Within the palace complex, tiled and carpeted and oriented precisely toward Mecca, as all Ottoman mosques were, the act of praying alongside senior women you would never have occasion to sit next to in any other context created a kind of temporary equality that the harem's social structure otherwise prevented. Not an equality that persisted beyond the prayer itself, but a genuine, briefly shared experience of something that stood outside the institution's ordinary categories. Ramadan was the most significant transformation of the annual calendar. The month-long fast from dawn to sunset restructured every aspect of daily life in the harem. Meals were rearranged, energies were redistributed, and the social atmosphere shifted into something that combined the heightened spirituality of sustained devotion with the particular social intimacy of people who are all slightly hungry together. The iftar meal that broke the fast each evening was the most social meal of the year, elaborate, festive, spread across tables that were more generously provisioned than the ordinary daily meals, shared in an atmosphere of genuine collective relief and celebratory warmth. The nights of Ramadan, particularly the last 10 nights which included Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power, were observed with additional prayers and recitations that extended through the night. Thus, women who had been sleeping their way through the boredom of ordinary evenings were awake and engaged during these nights in a way that gave the month a quality of intensity unusual in the harem's generally measured emotional register. Religious practice also provided for many women a genuine and private source of comfort. The harem was a life of limited control. Many of its inhabitants had not chosen it. The daily experience of existing within a system that determined where you lived, what you ate, when you slept, and what your future might hold was one that required, for psychological survival, some relationship with something that stood outside the system. Faith served this function with a reliability that the institution's own rhythms could not fully replicate. Whatever the harem controlled, it didn't control the interior space of devotion, and that space for many women was where the truest part of themselves continued to live. Inside the harem, gifts were not casual gestures. They were precise, calculated, and deeply meaningful communications conducted through the medium of objects. A kaftan presented by the Valide Sultan to a junior woman was not just a garment. It was a public signal of favour. A jewelled pin passed quietly between two women was potentially a transaction, material support in exchange for loyalty, information, or future assistance. The harem had its own internal economy, largely invisible to the outside world, in which cloth, jewellery, perfume, confections, and small luxuries moved between women as expressions of alliance, obligation, gratitude, and occasionally warning. Senior women had allowances, income provided by the palace administration that they could spend or distribute as they saw fit. This money gave them real power, the ability to reward loyalty, attract supporters, and demonstrate generosity, which in a closed social environment was one of the most effective tools available. The kaftan gift was perhaps the most legible signal in this system. When a senior woman gave a kaftan to someone below her in the hierarchy, the act was visible, it happened in the presence of others, it was noted, and its meaning was immediately passed by everyone who witnessed it. The quality of the kaftan communicated the degree of favour being expressed. A silk kaftan was a significant gesture. A kaftan with fur trim was an extraordinary one. A woman who received a kaftan from the Valida Sultan and wore it in the communal spaces afterward was communicating wordlessly something about her current position in the social landscape that every observer understood without the need for annotation. Confections were a softer currency, but a currency nonetheless. The palace kitchens produced sweets of various quality, and the distribution of particularly fine examples, a box of exceptional baklava, a selection of lokum made with expensive rosewater and real pistachios, was a gesture that said, in the language of things rather than words, that you were being thought of favourably by someone with access to the better pantries. On a day when the ordinary meals had been institutional, and the weather had been grey and the embroidery was not going well, receiving a small gift of sweets from a senior woman's attendant was a communication that landed with much more precision than any verbal message could have managed. Perfume and cosmetics occupied a similar register. The ingredients for fine cosmetics, kohl for the eyes, henna for the hands, specific oils and preparations for the skin and hair were not freely available to all women equally. The quality of what you had access to was itself a marker of your position. Receiving a bottle of fine rose oil or a quantity of imported henna from a more senior woman was simultaneously a practical gift and a social one, and the woman receiving it understood both dimensions immediately. What made this economy function was the precision of its grammar. Everyone in the harem had been trained, formally and informally, to read the language of objects and gestures with considerable accuracy. A gift that arrived unexpectedly from a woman you had not previously had much relationship with was interesting in a specific way. What had shifted? What was being communicated about future intentions? A gift that did not arrive on an occasion when one might have been expected was also interesting, in a different way. The absence of a gesture was itself a gesture, and the women of the harem read absences with the same attention they brought to presences. This was, in its way, exhausting. The social life of the harem required a constant low-level vigilance that was not quite paranoia, and not quite ordinary social awareness, but something in between. A sustained attentiveness to the meaning of things that most people in most environments never have to maintain quite this carefully. But it was also, for women who were good at it, genuinely interesting. It was a complex system, and navigating a complex system with skill is its own reward, quite apart from what the navigation produces. Some women were excellent at this. They moved through the harem's gift economy with a fluency that looked, to those watching, like natural social grace. It was not natural, but it was real, and it was earned, and it worked. Here are the final 5 segments, each fully developed to approximately 600 words. The harem had its own medical staff, because a population of hundreds of women required medical attention, and the palace was, among other things, an institution that took its operational responsibilities seriously. Female physicians and midwives worked inside the harem, attending to illness, managing pregnancies, and providing the kind of care that a closed institution needed to sustain itself. The most common ailments were predictable: respiratory illnesses that moved through shared sleeping quarters in winter, digestive troubles that came with any large communal kitchen operation, the complications of childbirth, which remained dangerous regardless of how many physicians were on hand. Plague was the great terror of the age. Constantinople was a trading hub, and the Ottoman Empire's vast movement of goods and people made it consistently vulnerable to epidemic disease. When plague came to the city, the harem would attempt to seal itself off more completely than usual, reducing contact with the outside world in ways that were not entirely different from what it already practiced. The medical knowledge available inside the harem was, by the standards of the era, reasonably sophisticated. Ottoman medicine drew on the classical traditions of Galen and Avicenna, the 11th century Persian physician whose encyclopedic medical texts had been the foundational reference for physicians across the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. The palace physicians understood herbal medicine with considerable depth, the properties of plants, their preparations as tinctures and poultices and teas, the specific applications for specific complaints. They understood the importance of diet in recovery, which meant that a sick woman in the harem was likely to receive better food during her illness than she had been eating beforehand, which was both medically sensible and somewhat ironic. What they did not understand, in the way that we understand it now, was infection. The concept of microscopic organisms as the cause of disease did not exist in the 16th century, which meant that the conditions most likely to spread illness, the crowded dormitories, the shared bathing facilities, the communal meals were not understood as risks. Ventilation was considered important, and the harem's architecture, with its courtyards and latticed windows, provided more of it than many comparable environments. But the specific precautions that would have meaningfully reduced the transmission of respiratory and waterborne illness were not available to people who did not yet know they were needed. Fever was the symptom that most reliably alarmed the harem's physicians, because fever was the body's most legible signal that something serious was happening, and serious things happening inside the harem had consequences that extended well beyond the individual patient. A sick woman who was also a senior woman was a disruption to the social order. A sick woman who was also pregnant was an emergency. The medical staff moved quickly in these situations, with a responsiveness that reflected both genuine concern and the institutional imperative to keep the harem's operations stable. The treatments available range from the genuinely effective to the optimistically wrong. Herbal preparations that reduced fever or eased inflammation worked, because the plants involved contained compounds with real pharmacological activity, even if the mechanism was not understood. Bloodletting, the removal of blood from a patient as a treatment for a wide range of conditions, was practiced and was almost never helpful and often actively harmful. But it was the standard intervention of the era, and the palace physicians applied it with the same confidence as their counterparts everywhere else in the world. Convalescence was managed in the harem with a practical compassion. A woman who was genuinely ill was relieved of her duties, moved to a quieter sleeping arrangement if possible, and attended to by other women whose role included this kind of care. The institution understood at a functional level that sick people recovered better when they were rested, fed, and not required to continue performing their regular obligations. This was not sentiment, it was operational logic. But it produced in practice a quality of care that was warmer than the logic that motivated it, which is how institutional compassion tends to work at its best. Inside the harem, bearing a son was the single most transformative event that could occur in a woman's life. Not because motherhood itself was extraordinary, though it was, but because producing a male heir fundamentally altered your position, your security, and your future within the palace's social architecture. A woman who bore the Sultan a son moved immediately and irrevocably into a different category. She was no longer a concubine in the general sense. She was the mother of a prince, and that relationship between her and that child was the most important one in her world going forward. The birth itself was attended by the senior women of the harem, by midwives, and by considerable ceremony. If the child was a boy, The announcement moved through the palace quickly. There were celebrations, gifts were distributed. The mother received new apartments, new staff, new income, and a new social status that nobody inside the palace was going to casually overlook. The approach of a birth was managed with the attentiveness the palace brought to all significant events. The expectant mother's diet was adjusted, her duties were reduced. The midwives who would attend the birth were experienced women whose entire professional identity was built around the management of this one event and its immediate aftermath. They knew what normal looked like and what complications looked like, and they understood that the birth of a potential heir was not an occasion for improvisation. Everything that could be prepared was prepared. Everything that could be anticipated was anticipated. And then, as with all births in all eras, the moment arrived and proceeded on its own terms regardless of what anyone had prepared. The birth room was a private space within the harem, its occupancy during labour restricted to the women whose presence was necessary. The midwives, the senior attendants whose role was to witness the birth officially, and the Valid Sultan or her representative. Because the production of a potential heir to the Ottoman throne was not an event that occurred without institutional oversight. The labour itself was managed with the herbal preparations and physical techniques that the midwives had developed through generations of practice, specific positions, specific preparations for pain, specific interventions for complications that experience had taught them to recognise. When a son was born, the news was carried immediately through the palace by messengers whose speed reflected the urgency of the information they carried. The announcement triggered a cascade of responses: prayers in the palace mosque, distributions of food and gifts to the palace staff, formal notifications to the appropriate officials in the outer palace administration. The new mother, though exhausted and horizontal and probably not entirely certain what had just happened to her body, was surrounded by women offering congratulations that were entirely genuine and also partly about what this development meant for the social mathematics of the harem, because in this environment the two things were never entirely separable. A daughter's birth was celebrated also, but differently and more quietly. A daughter was a child, and she was loved as a child, and her existence was valued. But she was not a potential sultan. She would not one day sit on the throne of the most powerful empire in the world. Her birth did not instantly rearrange her mother's position in the palace hierarchy in the same seismic way. She was a gift, and she was a joy, and she was, in the specific calculus of Ottoman dynastic politics, such a different category of outcome. The mothers of daughters remained in the harem and continued their lives. The mothers of sons became something else. Political figures, whether they sought that status or not, bound to the futures of their children in ways that would define every subsequent year of their lives. Having a son was, in every sense, both the greatest achievement and the beginning of the most anxious phase of a harem mother's life. Ottoman succession did not follow primogeniture. The eldest son did not automatically inherit. Every adult male of the imperial line was a potential sultan, and that potential made every other potential sultan a threat. The practice of fratricide, the execution of the new sultan's brothers upon his accession, was legally codified in the 15th century by Mehmed II, precisely because the empire had nearly torn itself apart in succession conflicts. What this meant in practical terms for every mother raising a son inside the harem was that she was raising not just a child, but a political project. His education mattered. His alliances mattered. His health mattered. His character, his abilities, and his proximity to the right mentors all mattered. Because the difference between her son becoming sultan and her son becoming an obstacle to the sultan was the difference between everything and nothing. The education of an Ottoman prince was formal, structured, and serious. He was taught Arabic and Persian, the languages of scholarship and administration. He was taught Islamic theology and jurisprudence. He was taught history, the history of the Ottoman dynasty and the empires that preceded it, the campaigns of previous sultans, the patterns of conquest and governance that had built the empire he might one day rule. He was taught mathematics and astronomy, the practical sciences of a civilization that took both seriously. He was taught calligraphy, which in the Ottoman world was an art form of the highest order, the beauty of the written word understood as a form of devotion. And he was taught to ride and to fight, because a sultan who could not lead men in battle was a sultan whose authority would always rest on shakier foundations than one who could. His mother was not his primary teacher in any of these subjects. The palace had tutors for all of them, senior scholars, experienced officials, men whose entire function was the education of princes. But she was the constant in his early life. The person whose presence was most regular and most intimate in the years before formal education took over entirely, and the influence of those early years was not negligible. The values she modelled, the habits of mind she encouraged, the emotional security or anxiety she transmitted in the daily intimacy of early childhood, all of it became part of him in ways that the formal curriculum could supplement but not replace. Her anxiety about his health was constant and not irrational. Child mortality in the 16th century was brutally high, even in a palace with better nutrition and medical care than the vast majority of the population could access. Fevers took children who had been healthy the previous week. Respiratory illness in winter moved through the palace quarters with a speed that made the most careful precautions feel insufficient. Each illness as uncontracted was a crisis that extended well beyond the medical into the political. A child who did not survive could not become sultan, and the years invested in his development and her own repositioning around him would dissolve without trace. She managed this anxiety the only way available, by paying very close attention to his health, his moods, his relationships with his tutors and his peers, to the environment around him, the people who had access to him, the food he was given. A mother in this position was, among other things, permanently alert to any possibility that the environment around her son was being shaped by interests other than his own. Other mothers had sons too. The harem contained in its senior tiers multiple women whose investment in their own child's future made the interest of the group reliably diverge from the interests of the individual. Everyone understood this, nobody said it, and everyone was paying attention all the time in the particular way that people pay attention when the stakes are genuinely this high. The harem was not entirely composed of women, and this is a fact that requires a little context to understand properly. The harem was staffed and guarded by eunuchs, men who had been castrated, typically in childhood, and who served as the intermediaries between the harem's inner world and the outer palace. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kislar Agassi, was one of the most powerful officials in the entire Ottoman Empire. This is not an exaggeration made for dramatic effect. The Kislar Agassi controlled access to the Sultan, managed the harem's internal administration, carried communications between the Valide Sultan and the Grand Vizier, and accumulated influence and wealth that made him a figure of genuine political consequence. The eunuchs who served beneath him were the ones who managed daily logistics, carrying messages, escorting women through the palace corridors, controlling who entered which spaces, and maintaining the physical separation between the harem and the rest of the palace that the whole system depended on. The eunuchs of the Ottoman palace came primarily from sub-Saharan Africa, a result of the specific trade networks and diplomatic relationships that supplied the palace with enslaved people from that region. The black eunuchs who staffed the harem were distinguished from the white eunuchs, who served in other parts of the palace, and the distinction was maintained with the same rigorous categorization the Ottoman bureaucracy applied to everything it administered. The Kislar Agassi, the chief of the black eunuchs, occupied an office that accumulated extraordinary authority over the centuries of the empire's history, to the degree that historians of the Ottoman court treat the position with the same seriousness as they treat the Grand Vizierate. Within the harem, the eunuchs were the mechanism by which the institution connected to the outside world. They carried letters between the harem's senior women and officials in the outer palace. They escorted women who needed to move through parts of the palace complex that required passage through corridors beyond the harem's interior. They managed the procurement of goods that the harem required, fabrics, medicines, food items of specific quality, materials for the workshops, negotiating with suppliers and officials in the outer palace on behalf of the institution's needs. Without the eunuchs, the harem was sealed. With them, it was permeable and controlled in specific ways that the institution's function required. The relationship between the harem women and the eunuchs was one of the most complex social dynamics inside the palace. The eunuchs were men, and therefore categorically separate from the women they served. They were also, in most cases, enslaved people of significantly lower social origin than the women whose needs they attended to, which created a specific power differential, and yet they controlled access, which meant they controlled something the women needed, which created a different and countervailing dynamic. Senior eunuchs who had been in the palace for decades had accumulated relationships and institutional knowledge that made them genuinely powerful in practical terms, regardless of their formal status. The Kisla Agazi was, in the most senior cases, a figure that the Validi Sultan herself treated with careful respect, not deference, not the deference of a subordinate, but the careful respect of someone who understood that this man's cooperation was operationally important and his opposition would be operationally inconvenient. He attended her councils. He carried her messages to the Grand Vizier. He was the physical link between her authority inside the harem and the political world outside it, which made him indispensable in a way that indispensable people tend to leverage, carefully and without ever quite stating it explicitly. For you, as a junior woman in the early stages of your residence, the eunuchs were primarily the people who controlled where you could go and who could reach you. They were gatekeepers in the most literal sense, and cultivating a civil, respectful relationship with the eunuchs who managed your section of the harem was a practical priority that the more experienced women around you had understood long before you arrived. You could not afford enemies among the people who controlled the doors. Not every woman inside the harem spent her entire life there. The institution had exits, though they were fewer and more conditional than the entrance. The most common form of departure was manumission, being formally freed, usually after years of loyal service. A senior woman might petition for the freedom of a trusted attendant. The Valid Sultan might free women from her household as an act of generosity. Women who were freed were typically also provided with a dowry in arranged marriages, often to palace officials or provincial administrators, which meant that the harem's social networks extended outward into Ottoman society in ways that were subtle but real. These women carried with them the education, the skills, the languages, and the refined understanding of palace culture that the harem had given them. They became wives of important men. They raised children in households that bore the indirect influence of everything they had learned inside those walls. And the palace they had left behind continued, as it always had, without pausing to mark their departure. The process of manumission was formal and legally significant. Ottoman law recognized the act of freeing an enslaved person as a meritorious deed, and the palace observed this tradition with genuine regularity. A woman who had served loyally for a specified number of years, who had demonstrated the qualities that the institution valued and that her patron was willing to vouch for publicly, could be granted her freedom through a legal document that had real standing in Ottoman courts. She was no longer property. She was a free woman with a legal identity, a dowry, and a future that was now, for the first time, and partly her own to shape. The arranged marriages that followed manumission were not love matches, but they were generally considered desirable outcomes rather than punishments. A woman leaving the palace with a palace education and a palace dowry was considered an excellent prospect by the Ottoman official class, whose members understood the value of what the palace had produced. The men she married were typically men of some substance: administrators, military officers, scholars, merchants with good reputations, and the households she entered were ones in which her abilities and her formation would be recognized and put to use. She might end up managing a household of considerable complexity, deploying the organizational and social skills the harem had spent years developing in her, in a context that was freer and more personal than the palace had been, but not entirely unlike it in its demands. Some women left the harem through the death of the sultan they had served, which triggered a restructuring of the entire institution around his successor. Concubines of a deceased sultan who had not borne him children might be pensioned off, provided with housing and income at the old palace, a separate institution on the other side of Constantinople, where retired harem women lived out their remaining years in a setting that was comfortable and completely removed from the centre of power. This transition was managed with bureaucratic efficiency and very little sentiment. The new sultan's harem was forming. The old sultan's household was concluding. The two processes were, from the institution's perspective, simply administrative realities. For the rare woman who had achieved genuine power, who had been a Haseki, who had borne a sultan a son, who had navigated decades of palace politics to a position of real authority, departure was almost never voluntary and almost never clean. These women were too embedded in the institution, too entangled in its ongoing processes to simply leave when they chose. Their exits were determined by the events around them: the death of a patron, the fall of a son, the accession of a new sultan whose interests did not align with theirs. The women who had risen highest had the most to lose and the fewest options for graceful withdrawal. But the women who left quietly, the ones freed after years of loyal service, given a dowry and a husband and a house in Constantinople, and carried something with them that the harem had not intended to give and could not retrieve. They carried themselves, everything the palace had built in them: the languages, the music, the needlework, the social intelligence, the capacity to read a room and manage a relationship and navigate a hierarchy with grace. These things went with them out the gate and into the city, into the wider Ottoman world, into households and families and lives that the palace walls could no longer see or monitor or evaluate. And there, in the ordinary texture of those ordinary lives, the harem's influence continued, quieter now and invisible, but genuinely present, woven into the women who had survived it, and taken what it gave them, and made of it something that was finally, at last, entirely their own. The harem contained hundreds of women, all living inside the same walls, all operating within the same hierarchy, all pursuing futures that were, at their most fundamental level, in competition with each other. And yet open conflict was extraordinarily rare, not because the women of the harem were unusually serene or unusually cooperative, but because open conflict was expensive in an environment where reputation was currency, and composure was one of the most valuable things a woman could demonstrate. You did not argue loudly with your rivals in the Ottoman imperial harem. You smiled at them with precise warmth, and you paid very close attention to everything they did, and you conducted your opposition through channels so indirect and so carefully maintained that an outside observer would have had difficulty identifying that any opposition was occurring at all. This was not dishonesty. It was the only form of competition the environment permitted, and the women who were best at it were formidable in ways that left no visible marks. Rivalry in the harem operated primarily through proximity and access. The woman who could position herself closest to power, closest to the Valid Sultan's attention, closest to the Sultan's notice, closest to the key eunuchs who managed the logistics of access, was the woman gaining ground. The woman being edged further from these centres of gravity was losing it. None of this required a confrontation. It required sustained, patient manoeuvring conducted over months and years in the medium of daily social life, where every interaction was simultaneously what it appeared to be and something else entirely. Think of it as a very long, fun, very elegant chess game played in real time, in a building full of other people also playing chess, none of whom would ever admit that chess was being played. Information was the primary weapon. Knowing something damaging about a rival was useful only if it could be delivered to the right person in the right way at the right moment, which required considerable judgment. Too early, and the information seemed petty. Too obvious, and the delivery revealed the hand of the person delivering it, which created its own problems. The ideal was a piece of information that arrived in the awareness of a senior woman as if by accident, through channels so circuitous that its origin was untraceable, and which landed with the weight of obvious truth rather than obvious agenda. Achieving this required patience and social intelligence of a genuinely high order. Many women attempted it. Fewer did it well. The ones who did it badly found that the information ricocheted and landed somewhere they had not intended, which was a professional setback with personal consequences. Alliances were the defensive answer to rivalry. A woman with a strong network of relationships, with other concubines, with senior attendants, with eunuchs whose goodwill she had cultivated with the women who managed the harem's daily administration, was a woman who was difficult to damage through the usual channels, because the channels were staffed by people who owed her something or liked her, or had been given concrete reasons to protect her reputation when it came up in conversation. Building this network was the work of years, and it required a consistency of behaviour that was itself a form of discipline. You could not be kind selectively and expect the network to hold under pressure. You had to be reliably kind, reliably trustworthy, reliably the sort of person that people instinctively wanted to defend, and you had to maintain this across the full spectrum of moods and circumstances that a life inside the harem produced, which included some circumstances that made reliable kindness a significant personal achievement and not a small one. Occasionally rivalry escalated beyond the social into something more direct. There are historical accounts of poisoning attempts, of sabotaged relationships, of accusations made to the wrong people with the specific intention of destroying a woman's standing in the hierarchy. These things happened. They happened less frequently than the romantic accounts suggest, because they were high-risk strategies in an environment where getting caught had catastrophic consequences, and where the same information networks that made the accusation possible also made the accusation's origin traceable. Most women preferred the lower-risk approach of quiet, patient erosion, but the awareness that the more dramatic option existed was part of the atmosphere of the harem in a way that could not be entirely ignored, and the wise woman maintained her alliances in part because she understood that they were also, in the worst case, a form of protection against the most extreme expressions of another woman's ambition. The women who navigated rivalry most successfully were the ones who never appeared to be navigating it at all, who seemed, to the casual observer, simply to be living their lives with grace and warmth and occasional good fortune. The effort behind this appearance was invisible by design and considerable in reality. It was, in its way, one of the most demanding performances the harem required, and the harem, as you have by now gathered, required quite a few. The stage was always set. The audience was always present. And the show, whether you felt like performing or not, continued every single day without intermission. The harem was sealed from the outside world in most of the ways that mattered for daily life. You could not leave. Visitors could not enter without elaborate permission and oversight, and the flow of information in and out was controlled by the eunuchs who managed the institution's connections to the outer palace and the wider city. And yet the harem was not, for its senior women at least, genuinely isolated from the world beyond its walls. It communicated, actively, deliberately, and with considerable sophistication. The senior women of the harem wrote letters. Not the casual correspondence of friends exchanging news, but formal, purposeful, politically conscious documents directed at officials, governors, foreign rulers and religious authorities, letters that carried the weight of the institution behind them and were received with corresponding seriousness by the people who opened them. The harem was enclosed. Its words were not. The most extensive surviving correspondence from the Ottoman harem is that of Hürrem Sultan Ninsofrol, whose letters to her husband Suleiman the Magnificent during his military campaigns in the 1500s are among the most remarkable documents of the 16th century. They are personal and vivid and emotionally direct in ways that the formal conventions of the era make genuinely surprising. She writes of missing him, of the children, of palace news, of her own health, of the specific quality of her unhappiness when he was absent, and they are also always politically aware. She asks questions about the progress of campaigns. She relays information about developments inside the palace. She advocates for specific individuals and specific outcomes, with a directness that makes clear she understood herself to be a participant in governance, not merely a bystander to it. The letters are simultaneously love letters and instruments of administration, which is exactly what you would expect from a woman who had long since stopped experiencing the personal and the political as separate categories. The physical act of writing inside the harem was itself a marker of education and status. Paper was available but not unlimited. Ink had to be prepared correctly. The reed pen used for Ottoman calligraphy required a specific cut and a specific angle to produce the strokes that the tradition demanded. And Ottoman calligraphy was a serious tradition, with aesthetic standards that a letter composed by a senior palace woman was expected to meet. A badly written letter from someone who should have known better was a social embarrassment. The quality of your handwriting communicated something about you before the content of what you had written was even processed. For women below the rank of Haseki, correspondence with the outside world was more limited and more thoroughly monitored. Letters leaving the harem passed through the eunuchs, which meant they passed through intermediaries who were simultaneously messengers and potential readers, and the women who wrote them understood this fully and composed accordingly. Genuinely private sentiments were encoded, abbreviated, or withheld entirely. Information that was sensitive was transmitted through trusted verbal messengers rather than written documents, because a spoken message left no evidence behind it, and a written one always carried the risk of being read by someone it was not intended for. Here, the women of the harem were not naive about the infrastructure through which their words travelled. Receiving letters was its own experience. A letter from the outside world, from a family member if contact had been maintained, from a former harem woman now living elsewhere in the empire, from a correspondent in another city, arrived as proof that the world beyond the walls still existed and still contained people who were thinking about you specifically. For women who'd been inside the harem for years, this was not a trivial thing. The letter was physical evidence of a connection that the walls worked, in their daily texture, to make feel abstract. You held it, you read it again, and then you decided carefully how much of it you would mention to anyone and how you would describe its contents if asked. Because even the receipt of a letter was information, and information inside the harem was never simply information. The letter was, in the end, the most powerful demonstration of something the harem's walls could contain the body but never fully contain. The reach of a mind that had decided it was going to participate in the world regardless of what architecture had been arranged to prevent it. The harem was an institution oriented entirely toward youth and fertility, and the political potential they represented. It selected young women, it trained young women, it presented young women to the Sultan, and managed the consequences of that presentation, and built its entire social ecosystem around the ongoing competition and cooperation of women in the years of their greatest political usefulness to the institution. Oh, what it did not particularly celebrate, and what it managed with the practical efficiency it brought to all inconvenient realities, was the process of growing old. Women aged in the harem as women aged everywhere, gradually, then suddenly, with the body making adjustments that no amount of rosewater and hammam time could entirely prevent. And when they did, the institution recalibrated its relationship with them in ways that were comfortable, managed, and almost entirely lacking in sentiment. Which is to say, the palace took care of you. It simply stopped paying close attention. The senior women of the harem, the older attendants, the experienced ustaz teachers, the women who had been inside these walls for decades and had outlasted multiple sultans and multiple configurations of the hierarchy, occupied a specific and genuinely respected category. Their knowledge was real and valuable in ways that youth could not replicate. They knew things about the institution that could not be found in any document because they had never been written down. The informal histories, the patterns of behaviour that repeated themselves across generations, the specific texture of how this particular place actually functioned in practice, as opposed to theory. A woman who had watched 3 Validi sultans manage the harem's politics, who'd seen women rise and rise again and fall for the final time, who could read the atmosphere of a room with an accuracy that came only from decades of attention. That woman was worth something that no young arrival, however gifted, could yet provide. This knowledge was transmitted orally, in the margins of lessons and the quiet hours of the hammam, passing from older women to younger ones in the way that all institutional memory passes, imperfectly, selectively, shaped by the perspective and the loyalties of the person doing the transmitting. The older women decided what to pass on and what to keep. They decided which young women were worth the investment of their knowledge and which ones were not. This was a form of power that operated entirely outside the formal hierarchy and was no less real for that. The woman who controlled what the next generation understood about how the institution worked was shaping the institution's future without holding any official position within it whatsoever. But respect did not mean centrality, and the distinction mattered. The older a woman became inside the harem, and the further she moved from the active centre of the institution's daily purposes, the sultan did not summon women past their fertile years. The political calculations around succession that had made a young concubine's position so consequential simply did not apply with the same force to a woman in her 50s whose children, if she had any, were already adults navigating their own trajectories in the wider world. She was no longer a variable in the active equation. She was, in the institution's unsentimental accounting, maintained and respected and consulted occasionally, and no longer watched with the same quality of attention that had characterized every earlier phase of her residence. There was, it should be said, a genuine relief in this. The performance that had structured so much of the previous decades, the careful presentation of self, the sustained composure, the daily vigilance about appearance and behaviour and social positioning, loosened its requirements as the years accumulated. Not entirely. The harem never entirely released you from its expectations, but the intensity diminished, the scrutiny softened. The woman who had spent 30 years being assessed at every moment was, in her later years, finally permitted to exist in the institution with something approaching privacy, because the institution had mostly stopped caring what she did with her afternoons. What remained, in the women who had navigated the harem's full arc from frightened arrival to settled old age, was something built over all those years of attention and adaptation and patient, unglamorous survival. A knowledge of people that no formal education could have provided, a capacity for reading situations and managing relationships refined by decades of practice in one of the most demanding social environments in the world. These things did not age. In fact, they sharpened, and the women who possessed them were, in the quieter way of people who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, formidable in a manner that had nothing to do with youth or beauty or political utility, and everything to do with having paid very close attention for a very long time. The palace had made them, it no longer needed them, and they continued anyway, because that is what people do. Here is segment 29, fully developed to approximately 600 words. The Ottoman imperial harem was formally dissolved in the early 20th century. In the years following the First World War and the collapse of the empire that had sustained it for 4 centuries. The last women to leave Topkapi Palace departed in 1909, when the Young Turk Revolution transferred the imperial household to a different palace and began the process of dismantling the institutions of the old order. Some of these women had been inside the harem for decades. They emerged into a Constantinople that had been transforming around them for years, a city of newspapers and telegraph lines and political movements, and ideas about individual freedom that the harem's walls had muffled but not entirely blocked. They stepped out into a world that was already, in most of the ways that mattered, a different world from the one the institution had been built to serve, and the institution closed behind them. 4 centuries of accumulated social architecture folding quietly into history. What it left behind was more substantial than its critics acknowledged, and more complicated than its defenders preferred. The harem produced women of extraordinary capability, educated, multilingual, politically sophisticated, skilled in music and textile arts, and the management of complex social environments that would have defeated less carefully formed people entirely. These were not women who had been simply preserved behind walls, waiting passively for history to move on without them. They had been trained, shaped, tested, and in many cases genuinely forged by an institution that demanded a great deal, and in demanding it produced something real. The Ottoman Empire at its height was shaped in meaningful part by the women inside those walls, through the influence they exerted on the sultans they were close to, through the sons they raised who became the men who ran the empire, through the correspondence they conducted and the alliances they built, and the institutional knowledge they accumulated over lifetimes and transmitted to the women who came after them. The physical legacy is visible in Istanbul today, if you know where to look. The mosques and schools and charitable foundations built by Valide sultans and senior harem women still stand across the city, some still functioning in their original purpose, some converted, some preserved as historical monuments that the city has grown around without entirely absorbing. Hürrem Sultan's Hammam, commissioned by the most famous Haseki in Ottoman history, and completed in the 1560s, still stands near the Hagia Sophia, its domed silhouette unchanged across nearly 5 centuries. The harem complex within Topkapi Palace is now a museum, its rooms open to the public, visitors moving through the tiled corridors and the courtyard spaces, and the small low-ceiling dormitory rooms where junior women slept in rows, trying to imagine the weight and texture of the social world that once filled these now silent spaces with the noise and heat and complexity of hundreds of lives being lived in close proximity. What is harder to see and impossible to fully quantify is the human legacy, the threads of connection and influence that ran outward from the harem into the wider Ottoman world, through every woman who was freed and married and who raised children and managed households far from the palace walls. These women carried with them the languages, the organisational intelligence, the social fluency, the refined aesthetic sensibility that the harem had spent years developing in them. They transmitted these things, without necessarily intending to, into the families and communities they became part of, shaping children and grandchildren and the texture of domestic life across the empire in ways that left no official record and no inscription and no monument, because these things never do. They are simply the invisible infrastructure of a civilization, built by people whose names the history books mostly did not think to preserve. The harem was, by the standards of any era including its own, a system of profound constraint. The women inside it did not choose to be there. Their freedom of movement, their freedom of association, their freedom to determine the basic shape of their own lives were all subordinated to the institution's requirements in ways that no amount of architectural beauty or material comfort could fully compensate for. This is true, and it matters, and it should be said plainly, without the softening that the romantic accounts have always been too eager to apply. And it is also true that the women inside that system were not only its subjects, they were also, many of them, its agents, working within the constraints available to them with an intelligence and a determination and a patience that the constraints themselves could not diminish. They found power in the places the institution left unguarded. They built authority through channels the institution had not entirely anticipated. They shaped the most powerful empire in the world from inside walls that were supposed to keep them separate from everything that mattered, and they did it without anyone officially acknowledging that it was happening, which is perhaps the most Ottoman thing about the whole story. The walls have been open for over a century now. The women who lived behind them are long gone, and the story, complicated, partial, still being pieced together from the documents and the architecture and the letters that survived, is still being told. Slowly, imperfectly, and with a growing awareness that what happened inside those walls was not a footnote to the history of the Ottoman Empire. It was, in ways that the official record consistently underestimated, part of the history itself. Written in rosewater and silk thread and careful, patient correspondence by women who understood that the most durable things are rarely the ones that announce themselves loudly. They are the ones that persist quietly through every attempt to contain them, and are still present long after the walls that were meant to hold them have become a museum and a memory and an afternoon's worth of wondering what it was actually like. Here is the outro, and so, here you are, still breathing, still horizontal, hopefully somewhere close to the edge of sleep, which is exactly where we want you. Tonight you walked inside the walls of the Ottoman imperial harem. You arrived frightened and disoriented, speaking the wrong language, wearing the wrong clothes, standing at a gate so large it felt less like an entrance and more like a statement. You learned Turkish and needlework and music and the precise art of reading a room full of people who were all simultaneously reading you back. You bathed in marble hammams and ate saffron rice and navigated a social hierarchy so finely calibrated that the colour of your kaftan was a complete sentence. You raised sons who might become sultans, and you managed rivals you never once acknowledged as rivals, and you wrote letters that crossed the walls that were supposed to contain everything you were, and sent your words out into the world anyway. You did all of this without a single door you could close behind you, without a room that was entirely your own, without the simple, ordinary freedom of deciding on a Tuesday afternoon that you wanted to go somewhere else. And you did it with a patience and an intelligence and a dignity that the official histories for a very long time did not think to record, because the official histories were written by people who were mostly not paying attention to the right rooms. The women of the Ottoman harem were not the passive, decorative figures of the European imagination, silken and silent and waiting to be rescued. They were educated, politically sophisticated, socially formidable people who built real power inside a system designed to contain them, and who shaped the course of one of the greatest empires the world has ever produced, from inside walls that were supposed to keep them separate from everything that mattered. They did this with embroidery needles and reed pens and carefully chosen words and the long, patient work of relationships built over years. They did this, most of them, without ever being thanked for it or remembered for it, or even officially acknowledged as having done it. So tonight, as you sink into your clean bed with your pillow at exactly the right angle and the fan running its soft, even breath across the room, take a quiet moment for the women of Topkapi. For the girl who arrived at those enormous gates not knowing a word of Turkish and learned to compose poetry in it. For the mother who lay awake monitoring the breathing of a sleeping prince and calculating futures with the focused anxiety of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. For the old woman in the corner of the courtyard who had seen everything and said very little, and knew more about how the world actually worked than anyone in the room would ever fully appreciate. They survived. They adapted. They found, inside one of the most controlled environments in human history, enough room to be themselves, or at least enough room to become someone worth being. That is not a small thing. That is in fact the whole thing. The fountains in those courtyards are quiet now. The hammam is cool. The embroidery frames are empty, and the music has long since faded into the particular silence of places where many lives were once loudly, privately, stubbornly lived. Let that silence settle over you now. Let your breathing slow. Let the walls of this particular palace dissolve gently around you, leaving nothing but the soft dark of your own room and the simple, extraordinary luxury of being exactly where you are. Good night, sleep well, and thank you as always for voyaging with us